The light outside McKinley Hall was fading that deep violet hour when the day surrenders but night hasn't fully taken hold. Inside, something else was stirring. Not the hum of excitement, but the buzz of tension, as if the room itself knew it was about to become a page in someone's story. Rows of polished wooden chairs stretched into shadow, filled with students in dark blazers, faculty with their pens poised, and local press-ready cameras gleaming like unsheathed blades. On stage, a single, long panel table, minimalist, professional. Name placards glinted under amber lighting. Every wire was taped down, every mic checked twice. "We're live in 7, a tech whispered into his headset. Backstage, Jasmine Crockett stood silently. No entourage, no reporters trailing her. Just her heels silent against the linoleum, a worn leather notebook in one hand, and presence. The kind of presence that doesn't ask for permission. She wore navy blue understated but sharp, her hair pulled back, her expression calm. Trailing just behind her, a woman in her 70s, hair streaked silver, a maroon shawl wrapped tightly across her shoulders like armor woven from memory. Her name was Althea, Jasmine's mother. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her steps alone carried stories. Instead of heading straight to the stage, Jasmine turned to her mother. She walked her down the aisle, not to the front row, but to the very back, to the shadows, to the seats where legacy often watches in silence. Jasmine placed a gentle hand on her mother's shoulder and said only, "I'll be right up there." Althea nodded once, folded her hands, and fixed her gaze forward, steady, patient, unshaken. Then came the other arrival. Marjorie Taylor Greene entered like lightning, all noise and heat, heels clicking. Aide on one side adjusting her mic pack, another flipping through cue cards. A third held a ring light clipped to her phone. "Make my entrance tight," Greene whispered, her voice sharp as glass. "Smile, then strike. We're here to go viral." She smirked. She hadn't come to debate. She came to perform. As she crossed the backstage line, students and volunteers exchanged glances. "Is it true she didn't even read the panel brief?" one whispered. "Doesn't matter," another replied. "She's here to light a fire." Greene strutted onto the stage like it was hers. Jasmine was already seated, flipping through her notes, composed, almost serene. Their eyes met. Jasmine's steady, Greene's scanning. Greene tossed a glance toward Jasmine's notebook and let out a scoff. "Old school," she muttered. The moderator stepped up to the mic, a soft-spoken man in a gray suit who looked more like a math teacher than the evening's host. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's panel on American youth leadership and civic duty," he began. Polite applause followed. Jasmine nodded respectfully. Greene flashed a tight-lipped grin like a pageant contestant masking a jab. The moderator continued, "Tonight's conversation will begin with guided questions, followed by audience interaction." But Greene raised her hand casually, slicing through his sentence like it didn't matter. "Can I say something real quick before we get into all the cookie-cutter stuff?" she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. The moderator blinked, a little flustered. Sure, Congresswoman." Greene turned to Jasmine. The camera zoomed in instinctively. The crowd leaned forward. "So Jasmine," she said sweetly, tilting her head just a little, "where's your mom from? Africa?" It hit like a dropped glass in a library. No one laughed. Not a chuckle, not a whisper. One student in the third row gasped. A professor lowered her glasses slowly, as if trying to make sure she heard correctly. A camera operator glanced at a colleague. "Did she just?" The moderator froze, pen still in hand, lips parted, but no words came. Even he knew this wasn't banter. This wasn't politics. This was a blow. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't fold. She just sat still, spine straight, breath calm. She had been here before, too many times. And she knew the difference between a real question and a setup. Across the room, Greene leaned back in her chair, pleased. That smirk, designed for the highlight reel. To go viral, to stir the pot, to trend. But the crowd didn't bite. Not tonight. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a room is a woman who says nothing at all. And sometimes, the most dangerous question is the one asked with a grin. The silence in the auditorium stretched like a pulled thread taut. Fragile, and on the verge of snapping. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not a twitch. Not a glance. Not a sound. Just the steady rise and fall of her breath, her fingers still resting lightly on her notebook like she was holding on to something more than paper. She didn't look at Marjorie Taylor Greene. She didn't need to. Because what Greene had just done, what she thought was clever, casual, a little edgy, wasn't new. It was old. Older than this building, older than the panel, older than Jasmine herself. It wasn't a question. It was a trigger, a signal, a performance cue. And Jasmine had learned, long ago, how not to perform for other people's scripts. Her fingers brushed the leather edge of her notebook like muscle memory, and suddenly, time folded inward. She was 13 again. 7th grade. Spirit Week. Crazy hair day. That morning, she had stood in front of the mirror with her mom. Althea had taken her time pulling, shaping, lifting Jasmine's curls into a soft, powerful crown. She used coconut oil, her palms moving with reverence, like she wasn't just styling hair but preparing a legacy. "You look like you own the sun," her mother said. Jasmine had smiled, nervous but proud. But by second period, that pride had turned to ash. A boy in her homeroom looked at her, squinted, and said, "Is your hair supposed to look like that? You look like a microphone." The class erupted. The laughter was sharp, cruel, loud. One kid even leaned forward to pretend he was speaking into her curls. A teacher at the front said, "Oh, kids, settle down," but never told them to stop. Not once. Jasmine didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't even shift in her seat. She stared down at her desk, heart thudding, cheeks burning, and wished for the bell to ring fast. She wore her hair flat the next day, and the day after that, and for years to come. Not because she stopped loving her hair, but because she stopped trusting the room. That memory lived under her skin, now not fresh, but not faded either, just resting beneath the surface like a scar that only burned when someone pressed in the exact wrong place. And tonight, Greene had pressed it. Hard. But Jasmine didn't respond the way she used to. She wasn't 13 anymore, and she wasn't sitting in a room full of classmates who didn't know any better. She was in a hall full of witnesses, and across the room, her mother was watching. Still standing, still silent. But Jasmine could feel her. That strength, that stillness, that same unshakable calm that once braided her hair while humming Nina Simone. Althea didn't raise warriors with noise. She raised them with vision. So Jasmine didn't take the bait. She didn't hurl a comeback. She didn't match disrespect with rage. She reached for the mic with the patience of someone who knows the real power comes, not from how fast you respond, but from how well you remember. She touched the mic gently, almost reverently. Not to amplify her voice, but to unearth the memory that voice carried. She didn't look at Greene. She looked inward. Because this moment, this silence, wasn't about Greene. It was about every classroom Jasmine had ever sat in, wondering if her name would be mispronounced again. Every office where her tone had to be triple-checked before she hit send. Every dinner table where she bit her tongue instead of explaining again why just a joke wasn't just a joke. It was about every girl who had swallowed words instead of saying them. Every woman who had smiled through disrespect. Every mother who taught her daughter how to survive without ever saying it out loud. Jasmine breathed in deeply just once and let her silence speak for all of them. She leaned in, steady, calm, and deliberate, and said nothing. Not yet. Because before the answer, there had to be recognition. And in that moment, she gave the room a chance to catch up, to feel the insult, to sit with the discomfort, to look inward and ask, why was that said? Why did it land that way? Why am I only now realizing what it meant? This wasn't rage. It wasn't confrontation. It was clarity rising through memory. And Jasmine let it resonate with fury, but with full awareness of what it meant to speak while being watched and still choosing truth. In the back of the room, Althea's spine straightened just slightly like a tree weathering the wind. Still silent. Still standing. But now, the room was beginning to understand who she was. This wasn't just a panel anymore. It was a reckoning in real time. And Jasmine was just getting started. Jasmine's fingers closed around the microphone, not with urgency, but with intention. It was a movement so small, so quiet, yet it pulled the entire room toward her. Every eye shifted. Every breath slowed. The tension in the auditorium wasn't just emotional now, it had become physical. A gravity was settling in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her tone. But what came out of her mouth reshaped the room. "I could answer your question," she said calmly, her voice low, controlled, unshaken. "But that would mean accepting the way you asked it." The words cut gently like a scalpel, not a sword. A ripple moved through the audience. No gasps. Just a tightening of postures. A shift in the air. The crowd wasn't reacting. They were receiving. Jasmine didn't look at Green. She wasn't there to educate her. She was there to name something that had gone unnamed too long. "You asked where my mother is from," she continued. "Not because you cared, but because you assumed." Then, before anyone could react, before the applause that would have broken the stillness, something happened that no one expected. Althea stood. In the back of the auditorium, silent until now, the small woman in the maroon shawl slowly rose to her feet. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She just stood. And with that simple act, the balance of power in the room shifted. People turned in their chairs. A camera instinctively panned back to catch her in frame. Even Green, who had been smug just moments earlier, blinked and turned toward the back. Because somehow, without saying a word, Althea had become the center of the room. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't defiant. It was undeniable. Jasmine felt it. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She had felt that presence her whole life. Her mother had never needed a microphone. She was the message. Jasmine continued, her voice now layered no longer just her own, but an echo of something older, something deeper. "You want to know where my mother's from?" she asked, looking straight ahead. "She's from Montgomery, Tuskegee, Selma. Not just cities, battlegrounds. She's from hospital floors, where she was told to clock in before she was allowed to be called by her name. From kitchens where white families trusted her with their children but not with their silverware. From sidewalks where she had to step aside not because she wanted to, but because the law said she had to." The words weren't performative. They were personal. They weren't written for sound bites. They were etched in lived experience. And the crowd? It didn't move. No one shifted. No one coughed. Even the air felt heavy like it, too, was carrying the weight of what was being said. "My mother," Jasmine went on, "raised 3 of us while working night shifts as a nurse's aide and cleaning houses by day." She paused not to gather herself, but to let the room feel every syllable. She made it to every PTA meeting, every scraped knee, every school play, every broken heart. She showed up always. Jasmine's voice softened, but never wavered. And she did it without anyone handing her a mic, without anyone asking what she thought. A lump formed in the throats of more than one person in the audience. It wasn't just admiration. It was reflection. Because everyone, in that moment, wasn't just seeing Althea, they were seeing someone they knew, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who stood quietly in the back row and made everything possible. Then Jasmine said something that stopped time. She marched in Montgomery when she was 16, not with a sign, but with her baby sister on her hip. She didn't raise her fist. She raised children. And while the cameras followed the men with megaphones, my mother walked the same miles in silence. Another silence followed, different now. This one was reverent. You could feel it, that collective realization that this was no longer a panel discussion. This was something else. This was memory, dignity, and defiance, all converging in a single moment. Althea still hadn't spoken. She hadn't moved since rising. But her stillness now felt like steel, like a monument that had always been there, we had just forgotten to look. And Jasmine? She stood not just for herself, Not just for her mother, but for every woman who had ever been asked to be small, to stay quiet, to smile through the sting. She looked out at the audience and said, without anger, without apology, "You asked me where my mother is from." Then she smiled just slightly and said, "She's from here, from this, from the back of the room, where dignity waits for its name to be spoken out loud." The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It had shape now. It had weight. It filled every corner of the auditorium like smoke, visible, inescapable, sacred. Jasmine Crockett stood at the microphone, not as a politician defending herself, but as a daughter honoring a legacy. Her voice never rose, but its clarity, it cracked the air. "You know what's often mistaken for weakness?" she asked. Her gaze shifted just slightly, not confrontational, not sharp, just direct. Stillness. A pause. She let it settle. "You think because someone doesn't react, they're fragile. Because someone doesn't clap back, they're conceding." Her eyes moved slowly across the audience. No one dared look away. "But what you call silence," she continued, "I call strategy." That line didn't land like a punch. It landed like a key unlocking something long locked away in the minds of those listening. You could feel it. The shift. The unraveling. Jasmine wasn't just responding to Green's insult anymore. She was rewriting the script mid-performance and handing it back with grace. Then, without raising her voice, she delivered the sentence that would live far beyond that room. Silence is not the absence of resistance. It's the preparation for it. And just like that, the room broke not in noise, but in understanding. Green blinked hard. Her expression, once smug and sure, faltered. Her note card sat untouched in her lap. Her hands, once so confidently performing gestures for the cameras, now hovered with no clear direction. Her smile, tight and practiced, had faded entirely. She opened her mouth barely as if to interject, but found nothing waiting there. No comeback, no clarity, just exposure. Because this wasn't about her anymore. The spotlight had moved, not just from her, but through her and onto something greater. The cameras, once trained equally on both women, had shifted, slowly, almost subconsciously. Now, they framed Jasmine in the photograph resting on the table before her, a black and white image of her mother in 1971, outside a hospital, back when dignity meant entering through the back door and enduring in silence. And behind Jasmine, Althea still stood, still silent, still composed. But now, she wasn't background. She was the moral center of the room. Jasmine didn't need to pause for effect. The room gave her the pause. She turned slightly toward Green, not to confront, but to clarify. "You weren't asking about my mother," she said. "You were setting a trap. You thought I'd either step into it with anger or disappear into silence. And either way, you'd win the clip." Green shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "But here's the thing," Jasmine said, voice steady. "I've seen that trap before, dressed in sarcasm, wrapped in just joking, polished in, don't be so sensitive, and I know exactly what it's designed to do." The audience was motionless. Even the moderator didn't dare interrupt. The air had changed. It was thick, not with conflict, but with consequence. Jasmine turned back toward the audience. "It's designed to make people like me look defensive, and people like you look bold. And I won't play that part," she said softly but clearly. "Because I didn't come here for your script. I came here for the record." Behind her, Green picked up her water bottle not because she was thirsty, but because her hands didn't know what else to do. She shuffled her note cards. Again. Again. As if doing so might restart the rhythm she'd come in with. But the rhythm was gone. The stage didn't belong to her anymore. Jasmine stepped back, just slightly. Her shoulders relaxed. Her fingers brushed the edge of her notebook again, the same one she'd carried since law school. The same one her mother once gave her when she was too young to speak but too smart to be ignored. She placed her hand on the old photo, gently, like you would on a grave or a promise. She didn't erase the rule, she said. She outlived it. That wasn't defiance. That was legacy. Green, for the first time in her political career, looked irrelevant. Not silenced, not defeated. Irrelevant. Because this moment had moved on without her. What began as a jab, a sarcastic, calculated line, had transformed, not into a takedown, but into a reckoning. Not a viral clip, but a generational declaration. Jasmine had never raised her voice. She had never looked for revenge. She had looked inward and drawn from something deeper than power. She had drawn from memory, from dignity, from a mother who walked miles without asking to be seen and raised a daughter who no longer had to ask. And now the crowd didn't just admire Jasmine. They understood her. Because in that room, clarity had replaced performance. And the most powerful person there wasn't the loudest. It was the one who refused to be reduced. The microphone rested where Jasmine had left it. The weight of her words still hung in the air, too sacred to disturb. No applause. Not yet. No one wanted to be the one to break what had just been built, not with noise, not with clapping, not even with breath. But something had shifted, something deep. And then it happened, not loud, not sudden. Jasmine turned slowly toward the back of the room, toward the woman who had stood, motionless, through every word spoken on that stage. Althea Josephine Grant. Her mother. The maroon shawl she wore seemed to glow now under the edge of the stage light, not like fabric, but like armor. Her face, lined with years, was unmoved. Her hands, still folded, had not shaken once. She had stood the entire time, without speaking, without stepping forward. But everyone in that room knew she had carried more than anyone there. And Jasmine? She raised her hand. Not high, not like a politician, but with quiet purpose. She pointed to her mother and said, "Don't clap for me. Clap for her." For a heartbeat, the room didn't move. Then, one by one, they rose. First, a student in the second row, then a professor, then someone near the back. Row by row, they stood not in admiration, but in acknowledgement. They weren't standing for a political win. They weren't standing for a debate performance. They were standing for a woman who had endured, for the woman who had walked in silence so her daughter could speak in clarity. There was no cheering, no yelling, just clapping slow, full, reverent. And it wasn't polite. It was recognition. Jasmine didn't soak it in. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She stepped back from the microphone, placed her palm on the photo still resting on the table, and gently, carefully lowered her gaze to her mother. She nodded once. Not for effect, for remembrance. And Althea? She finally moved. Slowly, she lowered herself into her chair. The movement was quiet, but it felt seismic. After all, she had carried in life, in silence. In this very room, she sat not in surrender, but in completion. She hadn't stood in protest. She had stood in presence. And now she remained no longer overlooked, no longer unnamed, no longer in the back. The camera panned again, unprompted, just in time to capture her hands resting on her lap. Not clenched, not trembling, steady, as if to say, "My work is not done. It has been passed." Back on stage, Jasmine remained still, watching the room, absorbing the energy. She hadn't come to go viral. She hadn't come to defend herself. She came to plant something. And now she saw it growing, not on screen, not in headlines, but in posture. The way students stood taller now. The way professors dabbed at the corners of their eyes without embarrassment. The way even the staff had stopped moving, listening as if this were the first real moment of the evening. She returned to the microphone not to speak again, but to finish what had begun long before the first insult. She picked up a small, spiral-bound notebook from her bag, the kind her mother had once given her when she was just a girl too shy to speak but too bold to ignore. She held it up and said quietly, "Every word I spoke tonight started here. In this, in silence, in remembering." There was no applause. There was reverence. Then, from the back row, the most unexpected sound filled the air. Althea's voice. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. She said, almost in a whisper, "She was born with a voice. I just made sure." She never forgot how to use it. Gasps, then stillness again. Jasmine turned toward her eyes, wide, full. And with tears she didn't try to hide, she answered, "I never forgot. That was it. No big finale. No performance bow. Just truth given, received, honored. The moderator didn't resume the panel. He didn't read from his cards. He just stood there, glasses in one hand, script forgotten, because everyone in that room knew the program was over. But something far more important had just begun. Students would leave that hall changed. Not louder, clearer. They would remember the voice that didn't flinch, and the mother who didn't move. They would carry with them the lesson Jasmine had left, not in anger, but in example. That dignity doesn't have to shout, and legacy doesn't need a mic. The lights never dimmed, but something had changed. The room was no longer a panel hall. It was a memory chamber, a sacred place. Jasmine Crockett had returned to her seat, her microphone untouched, her voice at rest. But the silence she left behind, it was anything but empty. Students sat still not because they were waiting for the next moment, but because they were still inside the last one. A professor near the front slowly removed her glasses, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She folded her notepad shut. Nothing more needed to be written. Not tonight. At the tech table, the AV crew stared at their monitors, unmoving. "We just filmed history," one whispered. The other nodded, and it didn't even raise its voice. Across the aisle, a young woman, hoodie sleeves past her wrists, pressed a notebook to her chest. Her pen dangled in her fingers, forgotten. She had pages of notes, outlines, and questions. But all of it now felt small. Because what she had just witnessed wasn't a panel. It was instruction. Not about policy, but about presence. A presence passed quietly from mother to daughter. And now, silently, into a room full of strangers who felt like family in grief and awakening. On the table beside Jasmine sat the photo, the woman in black and white who had once been told to use the back door. Now, her story was at the center of the room. No spotlight. No headline. But somehow, everyone saw it clearer than ever. Althea still sat upright in the back, shawl folded neatly over her shoulders, her hands clasped calmly in her lap. She had not moved since sitting down, but the posture of the room still revolved around her. Because what she carried wasn't fame. It was weight. And everyone now felt it. The moderator shuffled his cards, unsure whether to resume or remain in stillness. None of his talking points applied anymore. None of his planned segues fit. He glanced toward Jasmine, a quiet signal, a professional reflex. But Jasmine didn't speak. She simply nodded, gently, as if to say, "We've said what needed to be said." Finally, a voice broke the stillness. Not one of power, but one of permission. A student, barely 19, raised her hand. She stood, notebook in her arms, heart clearly on display, and asked, "Congresswoman Crockett, how do you stay centered when you've just been targeted?" The words didn't feel like a question. They felt like a whisper from one soul to another. Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She turned to the girl and gave her something rare in public life, her full, unguarded attention. Her voice was soft, but anchored. "I stay centered by remembering who I'm really speaking to." The girl blinked. Jasmine continued, "I wasn't speaking to her, or to the cameras. I was speaking to you, to the ones watching, the ones wondering what they would have done if that question had been aimed at them." The audience leaned in not for drama, but for clarity. See, people like that, they don't provoke for truth. They provoke for spectacle. They want your rage, because your rage becomes their moment. But when you remember your audience, not the stage, but the witness, you stop reacting, and you start reframing. She paused. Let it breathe. "I wasn't there to fight her," she said. "I was there to protect the record." The room stilled again. But now, it wasn't stunned. It was awakening. A young man in the front row, arms once crossed, let his shoulders fall, as if the defense he'd been holding all evening had quietly unraveled. A student whispered to her friend beside her. This wasn't about being right. It was about being remembered. The moderator didn't interrupt. The panel was officially over, but the learning had just begun. Jasmine reached for her notebook once more, not to flip through notes, but to show something. She opened the front cover and revealed handwriting, uneven, raw, her mother's blank. A single quote written in blue ink. Calm isn't weakness, and silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. Jasmine smiled softly. This, she said, is the first thing I ever wrote in this notebook. And then she closed it. Not as an ending, but as an invitation. An invitation for every woman, every student, every person in that room to do the same, to write, to carry, to speak when the moment demands, and to know when silence isn't submission. Before the crowd could react, she added, "Legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a woman in the back row, standing. And sometimes it looks like the room that chooses to stand with her." That was the true closing line. Not applause. Alignment. Because when legacy becomes curriculum, people don't cheer. They change.